If you've taken any of our courses or trainings before, you've probably heard the term orphaned part, and today I want to talk about exactly what that means. An orphaned part is essentially a split off part of our psyche, a split off part of our being. And these parts split off during times of extreme emotional distress. Whenever we go through something very, very stressful and heavily emotional and we aren't able to process that and find some resolution and completion around it, then essentially the stress loop remains open and never closes. You can call it a traumatic event, an undigested life experience that remains undigested. The language is less important, but we need to see it as a moment our body is flooded with stress hormones and emotional biochemical reactions, and we never find full completion or resolution with that. We disintegrate to an extent. You talk about a lot, you might hear in therapy circles or in the healing world, this process of healing is one of integration. Well, in order to integrate, we must have at some point become disintegrated. And that's what we're talking about today. We take this part of us in the moment and we put it out here. Okay, I'm using that as a visual. We don't literally take it and put it out there, but this is the process of what happens. We take a part and put it out here, and we do that for two reasons. The first one is if this part, which is heavily emotionally charged, is out here and not in here, then it hurts less. We've been trained at a very, very young age in this culture to have a massive aversion to emotional pain and emotional disturbance and suffering. Because of that, the less suffering that we feel internally, the better, we think. So we take the part and put it out here. It doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. It still does, but not to the same extent if we fully held it within our being. That's the first reason. The second reason, if I take the part and put it out here, then I can keep an eye on it to an extent. And by keep an eye on it, I mean I can watch in my day-to-day life from that point forward and keep an eye out just to make sure that something similar or the same isn't going to happen again. This function is wonderful for your survival. It's fantastic for the survival of a human being. At the same time, it is terrible for our mental and emotional health. It robs us of our peace and joy. We're essentially exchanging survival for our peace and joy. And we're not doing that consciously. It is an unconscious process. The problem then becomes, I'm on some form of high alert from that day forward to some degree, looking out for that same thing that may happen or may not happen again. And it generally does start to show up in our life in different forms. So, we may have had an abusive father that was an unclosed loop, and then all of a sudden 10 years later our boss becomes our father. This is that part, that orphan part, just showing up in a different form. We may have had a mother that abandoned us, and then all of a sudden that shows up 20 years later in relationship, that orphan part once again showing itself in a different form. And it can show up in so many different forms: work, relationships, friends, family, money, all of that kind of stuff. And so what happens, we have so many of these orphaned parts out here, and we're always on high alert looking out for them, that we're always on edge to an extent, because we're always hyper vigilant looking out for these parts to show up again. The reason why we're doing that is because we want to protect ourselves from feeling to the same degree the extreme emotional pain that we felt at the originating event. So it's a protection mechanism for survival, which, like I said, keeps us out of creation, which is peace and joy and love and all those beautiful states. Once we're chronically in this hypervigilant state for years, for decades, then all of a sudden we start to reach for things outside of us to help us deal with that. Once again, our natural human reaction to try and stop the emotional disturbance and the emotional pain, which compounds over time, even though we were trying to avoid that by orphaning the part in the first place. But the truth is, instead of reaching for the alcohol, the drugs, the gambling, the shopping, the sex, the food, the work, the codependent relationships, what we need to be reaching for is these orphaned parts and grabbing them, working with them, loving them, understanding them, and welcoming them back home in here into our heart, so that once again we can be an integrated human being without having to look externally for our peace and joy and happiness. And we don't have to worry so much about survival. We can worry about creation, which is what we are really, really here to do. Embodied processing is a wonderful way of starting to welcome these orphaned parts back home. And if you want more information on that training and that modality, then I hit the link either above or below. Peace out.